we come to the final installment of this series on sunscreen. In the previous two videos, we covered the eldritch horrors of the colors out of space, aka electromagnetic radiation. The molecular biology of how different types of sunscreens can protect us from those horrors, and we busted some of the most common myths about sunscreen and its usage. So now that we know what sunscreen does and how it does it, it's time to talk about one of my favorite subjects: the dangers of capitalism. There are approximately 12 bajillion D sunscreens out there, all of them clamoring for your attention and ultimately your hard-earned dollars. How on earth can anybody be expected to pick one and have it actually work for them? Well, obviously there's no such thing as a truly universal sunscreen that's gonna work really well for absolutely everybody. That's just not possible. But what we can do is figure out some basic guidelines that will make it more likely the sunscreen that you pick is actually going to fill your needs. Let's start with what type of sunscreen might be best. There are lots of different formats, delivery vehicles for sunscreen. The most obvious one is, the old tube of cream, which I prefer because it's really easy to use. It's easy to figure out exactly how much to apply, and it's easy to apply. But more on that later. There are also aerosol sprays, which sometimes have the unfortunate side effect of setting people on fire, not because of the organic sunscreen filters, but because the chemicals responsible for aerosolization are highly flammable. There's sunscreen powders, which are great for blotting oil on your skin, for reapplication, or for boosting your sunscreen coverage, but not recommended as a primary sunscreen. For more on that, see the previous video. There's sunscreen sticks, which I don't really care for because I find them to be drying on my skin, but if you have oily skin, you might actually like that a lot. There's even sunscreen in cushion form, although that's kind of hard to get your hands on in the West. Again, I think that the bog standard cream in a tube is best, especially if you're new to skincare, because, it's basic. But we all have different needs, so don't be afraid to look into less conventional methods of sunscreen delivery if that's what might work for you. One type of sunscreen that I absolutely do not recommend is anything in an oil form that comes with a dropper. There aren't many of these out there, but they're pretty insidious. They encourage you to just mix a few drops in with your moisturizer and bam, instant sunscreen. Without stating, of course, that doing so actually dilutes the sunscreen coverage and pretty much makes it impossible to get to the level of SPF that's stated on the bottle. My point from the previous video applies here. More is more when it comes to sunscreen. Always pick the higher SPF whenever possible, and especially the higher UVA protection. So always aim for 4 PA pluses, for 4 or 5 boot stars, and for an SPF of 50 plus or 60 if the sunscreen in question has that UVA circle on the bottle. American sunscreens don't come with any of this information, which is why I don't buy them, but more on that later, because most people don't properly apply sunscreen. If you want to get to that high number, then you either need to be extremely meticulous about your sunscreen application, or you want to pick a really high SPF so that improper application won't totally ruin things. Texture is super important. A lot of dermatologists have a saying that the best sunscreen is the one you'll actually wear, and this is true. It's going to be really difficult to motivate yourself to use a sunscreen where you absolutely hate the way it feels on your skin. This is why so many people only wear sunscreen when they go to the beach, when most people should be wearing it every day. Next generation organic filters are really awesome. Here's a list of what I think are the best next generation organic sunscreen filters. Ta-da! Why haven't people heard of these filters? Why don't we have just a never-ending paradise of amazing sunscreens made with only next-generation chemical filters, with none of us are having problems with our skin or eyes, and nobody has to worry about white cast? Well, this is going to be a special section, and it's called Why American Sunscreens Suck, Why I Don't Buy Them, and Why You Shouldn't Either. The problem with next-generation organic filters is that the FDA has not approved any of them in more than 20 years. In the United States, sunscreen is regulated like a drug, which on one hand is absolutely wonderful because that means that all of these sunscreen filters have been tested and retested to make sure that they're not only safe, but also effective. The problem is that the FDA is apparently run by a bunch of stupid buttholes, and they have left applications for approval sitting around since 1990. $99. That's why you hear about people saying, oh, I can't do chemical sunscreens because they just irritate my skin way too much. They sting my eyes. They break me out. Well, that's because in the United States, which is a huge market and which makes a ton of sunscreens and sells a ton of sunscreens, they are not allowed to use any of the really awesome new chemical filters. And there's no end of that in sight. There have been a couple of bills passed that seemed like they were trying to jumpstart the process back in like 2013 and 2014, and yet nothing happened. In the United States, you literally have only one option for a chemical UVA protectant, and that's avobenzone, which is a stinging photo-unstable monstrosity. Your UVB options aren't all that much better with oxybenzone and octinoxate. There are combination mineral organic sunscreens, which can be great, but in the United States, you're also not allowed to combine zinc oxide and avobenzone. So you're just screwed in terms of UVA protection. So yeah, you can get a chemical sunscreen in the United States, but it's gonna be absolute crap compared to the kind of sunscreens you can get from Korea, Japan, or Western Europe. Those countries have all had next generation chemical sunscreen filters for years, like more than 20 years. Here's hoping that the FDA pulls its head out of its ass, but God only knows when that's going to happen. Whenever I see an American sunscreen company advertising how its sunscreen is not like the other girls, it's so much better than all those other gross sunscreens that are greasy and disgusting and rely on mineral filters, it's just marketing. Companies like Supergoop that talk about the superiority of their sunscreens, it's all just marketing. It's the exact same chemical filters that everybody else has in the United States, the exact same crap. I would say avoid American sunscreens. Vote with your wallet. Maybe the FDA will finally get it through their thick, stupid heads that it's time to approve some of those newer sunscreen filters. The United States is falling farther and farther behind with every passing year. As a side note, I start to wonder, is there some kind of conspiracy going on with like anti-aging skincare companies paying off the FDA to ignore these sunscreen filters or something? It's so weird. It's absolutely bonkers to me that 20 years later, the FDA has not budged an inch on these newer filters. Big hat. That's it. It's Big Hat's fault that there's no decent organic sunscreen filters in the US. Part of why it's important to look into the filters in your sunscreen is that some companies like to use fancy names for their own patented versions of sunscreen filters, and in doing so, they can conceal the fact that those filters actually aren't all that great. Neutrogena is one of the biggest offenders here. Their marketing copy brags all about their patented sunscreen filter called Helioplex, and how it's so broad spectrum. I mean, it ought to be, considering that it is a chemically bound UVA filter to a UVB filter. Problem is that the UVA filter is avobenzone, and the UVB filter is oxybenzone. Oxybenzone is just gross. It burns, it stings, it'll break you out. It's commonly known as just a straight up skin irritant. And a lot of people who think they can't do organic sunscreen filters have probably just had a go around or two with a Neutrogena product. But when you hear the word Helioplex, it's like, oh, yes, this amazing patented ingredient. It's so fancy. It's science. It's just regular old-fashioned chemical filters. The kind that you can get in the United States. It's nothing special. Don't be fooled by marketing. In such a crowded market where there's so many sunscreens to pick from, it is essential to have as much information as possible so that you can make the most educated choice. I know that a lot of those sunscreen names and the names of chemicals in general can be really intimidating and scary sounding if you're not trained in how to interpret them. Thankfully, most sunscreen filters also have like a trade names and abbreviations as well as their full chemical names. I would say learn those trade names. That way, when you're perusing ingredients lists, you'll know what to look for. And of course, if you see an ingredient and you don't know much about it, don't be afraid to Google it. Although, do be afraid of getting information from sources like the EWG, which is absolutely not to be trusted. That's a subject for a whole nother video. But basically, the EWG exists to frighten you out of buying certain products and frighten you into buying the products that they are sponsored by, because they're a pay-to-play organization ruled from a throne of lies. A good rule of thumb is that if somebody is trying to demonize organic or chemical sunscreen filters, then they don't know shit about fuck. And you can tell them I said that. If you have sensitive skin, sensitive eyes, or if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, definitely avoid older organic filters like avobenzone, octinoxate, octocrylene, homosalate, and oxybenzone. It's good to just avoid oxybenzone altogether. At least don't slather your nipples in sunscreen while you're breastfeeding. I don't think babies like that. Pretty sure. For people with dark skin, avoid mineral-only sunscreens. It will only end in heartbreak. I've never actually seen an all-mineral sunscreen that goes on without a white cast. Who knows, maybe this mythical unicorn product exists somewhere? I haven't seen it. Even tinted mineral sunscreens may not have enough pigmentation to properly cover the white cast if you have dark skin, resulting in an ashy appearance. I don't want to make mineral sunscreens out to be the actual devil that organic sunscreen filters have been made out to be. It's just that I find them pretty unpleasant for reasons I've already discussed. Make sure to avoid added fragrance, but especially any citrus essential oils. As I've discussed in previous videos, citrus essential oils contain chemical compounds called psoralens. And psoralens, when activated by the sun, go into your cells and fuck everything up. They're the absolute worst. I fucking hate them. And the thought of putting them into sunscreens is so mind-bogglingly stupid that any company that does that should be shot out of a cannon into the sun. Yeah. Since sunscreens with really good texture and little white cast can be on the more expensive side, save the really good stuff for just your face. I, for one, care a lot less about the sunscreen that I put on my body as long as it's got a high SPF in it and isn't, you know, completely disgusting. It doesn't matter all that much. I want it to be cheap and to come in gigantic tubes or maybe even one of those freaking pump things. My expensive Japanese sunscreens, only the face. Maybe the cleavage. I don't want to get, you know, the old lady leathery thing before my time. Like I said, once I hit about, I don't know, 80, 85, I'm prepared to go full sea hag, and it's gonna be awesome. I'm gonna frighten all of the neighborhood kids. It's very rare to find a sunscreen that can actually do it all, meaning that it's a good sunscreen to wear both every day, like under your makeup, and to the beach. You may want to consider having separate sunscreens to fulfill different needs. One is your sunscreen for going outdoors and doing strenuous physical activity out in the sun, and one is your sunscreen for just normal, everyday wear. For some people, those things are a perfect overlap, but definitely not everybody. If you're going to be doing any physical exertion in the sun, then it's also good to look for something that is water and sweat resistant, so that it's not going to come off easily, thereby diluting the amount of protection you're getting. Generally, any product like that is going to advertise it right on the bottle. Don't be afraid to be picky. Try sunscreens until you find the one that's exactly right for you. It might help to find somebody on YouTube or somebody who has a blog about skincare who has a similar skin type to you. That way, if your skin is dry or oily or a combination, or if you suffer from similar skin conditions like acne or hyperpigmentation, you can look into what sunscreens they're using and that might be better for your skin. But while being picky is good, you may have to compromise on one or more things that you want. So figure out what your priorities are. What is more important to you? A complete and total lack of white cast or a feather-light texture, for example. Thankfully, with the march of progress inexorably going forward, at least in places that aren't the United States, sunscreens have been getting better and better, and hopefully no one in the not-so-distant future will have to compromise. Sunscreen formulation is very difficult. Some sunscreen filters dissolve in oil, some of them dissolve in water, some of them kind of do both, but they don't do it very well. Some don't dissolve at all and have to be used as a suspension of particles, like the tinosorbs. This is the reason why octinoxate is still so popular as an organic filter, because it dissolves in water, and thereby allows for a much lighter, more pleasant texture on the skin. Part of what makes sunscreen more expensive than other types of skincare products is just how difficult it can be to formulate it well. But okay, let's say you found your perfect sunscreen, or at least the one you'll actually wear. How do you know how much sunscreen to actually apply? Are you really supposed to reapply every 2 hours? Thanks to the hard work of scientists, we actually do have an approximate idea of how much sunscreen you should apply to your face. In order to get to the SPF number that's displayed on the bottle, what you need is about 2 milligrams of sunscreen per centimeter squared of surface area on your face. There are videos out there of amazing people taping paper to their face and whatnot so they can figure out the exact surface area of their face. But if you don't want to do that, there's a really easy rule of thumb. If you are applying sunscreen to just your face, you need a 1/4 teaspoon, which conveniently is also 1 milliliter. And if you're doing your face, your neck, and your ears, then go for 1/2 teaspoon or 2 milliliters. For your entire body and for like a day at the beach, you want a full ounce of sunscreen, or roughly what would fit in 1 shot glass. The whole 1/4 teaspoon and 1/2 teaspoon are based on measurements for men in the 95th percentile of face size, meaning men who have faces larger than all but 4% of the population. These are big-faced men. Is that that a band maybe? The big faced men? So it's probably an overestimation, but that's not a bad thing. When it comes to sunscreen, it's always better to do more than to do less. I like the quarter teaspoon thing. It might seem a little bit ridiculous to actually take your sunscreen and measure it out into this little amount, but the nice thing is you can measure it out, glop it into your hand, and then train yourself to recognize how much is the right amount. And then from that point on, you can just start eyeballing it. I go with the quarter teaspoon because I only do my face with expensive sunscreens. I do my ears and my neck with cheaper sunscreens, where I don't feel shy about just how much I can glop onto me. If you prefer not to use a rule of thumb, then there's always the 2-finger rule. I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. The 2-finger rule is really nice and simple. You literally just take your index and middle finger and squeeze out 2 strips of sunscreen, one as long as each, and then you apply those to your skin. You may actually be surprised by how much sunscreen that is, but remember, more is always more. Sometimes sunscreen can be hard to apply. Most of the time, it's not clear. It comes out in this big white glob. Well, how on earth can I possibly get this into my skin and make it look not gross? The solution, as it so often is with skincare, is to apply it in layers. So what I like to do is I put in the big glob of sunscreen in my hands, just dip some, put on 1 layer of it, pat it in, give it a few seconds, and then I go back for another layer, and then even another one, depending on how many layers it takes until it's fully absorbed into my skin. That's it. It's real easy, and it works very, very well. One important thing to do after you apply sunscreen is to give it about 15 to 20 minutes to let it set up into a film on top of your skin. There's a myth that organic sunscreen filters as opposed to mineral filters actually require that 15-20 minutes, otherwise they don't work, but that's completely untrue. They do work just fine. It's just that any sunscreen, be it organic or mineral, is going to do a better job if you give it some time to sort of evenly spread out across your skin and make that nice protective barrier. I recommend applying sunscreen every single day. There are plenty of people out there who will tell you that you shouldn't bother unless you've checked the UV index for the day and it's actually really high, but I disagree. Why? Because sunscreen, like any other skincare product, only works if you use it consistently. Good habits take maintenance, and it's a lot easier to maintain a habit when you actually do it every day. Also, I am lazy as hell, and like the idea of going and checking the UV index and then thinking about, oh no, like should I actually bother to wear sunscreen? Like that sounds like way too much work, way more work than it takes to just literally slap on some sunscreen as the last part of my skincare routine in the mornings. So the big question, reapplication. Every dermatologist on earth will tell you that in order to maintain the level of protection that's advertised on the sunscreen bottle, you need to reapply sunscreen every 2 hours. While that is true, like if you want to keep the exact amount of protection that's labeled on the bottle, then yeah, 2 hours is what will keep you there. That said, and maybe dermatologists are going to come to my house with pitchforks and torches, but nobody does that. If you have a medical condition that makes you allergic to the sun, if you got something like xeroderma pigmentosa, then yeah, obviously a big part of your life is going to be constantly slathering on sunscreen to protect yourself from the sun. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about day-to-day use for people that don't have sun allergies. These sorts of recommendations are great for when you're at the beach or if you're going hiking in the Swiss Alps. If you're going to be exposed to a shit ton of sunlight when the sun is at its peak from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. That is when you do need to be reapplying every 2 hours and covering any exposed skin with UV protective clothing if you can't douse it in sunscreen. That's generally not what most people are doing on a day-to-day basis. If people actually followed those guidelines, I can't even imagine how expensive that would get. You'd be expected to cover your arms and your legs, your neck and your face every 2 hours. You would go through like an entire tube of sunscreen in a week. That's friggin' insane. What if the only sunscreen that works really well for you is kind of pricey? No, that's nuts. So how often to reapply in that case? Well, what can you do? In these sorts of circumstances, it's not good to be really rigid and dogmatic about your principles and tell people, no, you can only apply every 2 hours. That's how you have to do it. Or everything is worthless. Don't wear sunscreen at all if you're gonna mess it up. Ah! A lot of people in their regular lives are just gonna be able to slap some sunscreen on in the morning and call it good. And you know what? That's okay. It's not the ideal, but it's okay. It's absolutely better than nothing. If you're spending most of your time indoors, unless you're doing it under a UV lamp, then you do not need to reapply every 2 hours. Both you and your skin will be fine. Do not let that recommendation make you paranoid. Now, if you're working really hard to heal some kind of skin condition, and especially if that involves any kind of exfoliating treatment, like chemical peels, especially the one that's so popular from The Ordinary right now, then yeah, you probably do want to reapply at least once, even if you're indoors most of the time. After I've done a chemical peel, even though I don't use anything as strong as 30% glycolic acid, I absolutely stay out of the sun, and on those days, I will reapply at least once, maybe twice. And on those days, I'm also not wearing makeup, which is important because speaking of, a lot of people wear makeup. And while there's some really amazing videos out there showing how you can very carefully apply sunscreen on top of your makeup, ostensibly without disturbing it, you have to be so careful. And even then, you're wearing a lot of blush, for example, it might not work. This is also not a thing that a really busy person could be expected to work into their routine. There are some types of sunscreen that are uniquely well suited to reapplication. This is the time for those cushion foundations with sunscreen. Yes, it's not going to give you coverage equivalent to the SPF that it lists, but that's okay. This is for topping up a previous sunscreen application. This is the time for sunscreen powders. This is the time for those Japanese makeup setting sprays that have sunscreen in them, and the like. Sunscreen in stick form can be really useful here, especially like reapplying to your chin, your nose, and your forehead. I think a good compromise is, let's say you walk to and from work. You can apply it once in the morning and then reapply before you walk home if the sun is still out. It's important to understand your own limitations, and that includes budgetary limitations. Not everyone can afford to buy 3 or 4 tubes of sunscreen every month, and that is absolutely a thing that dermatologists should consider when they're giving out that kind of advice. Which is again why it's so important to have as much information as possible. The reapplication conundrum is actually why I pick sunscreens that have really long-lasting, really photo-stable filters. It's important to just do what you can and not feel bad about that. The truth is that most people are just never going to be able to work reapplication every 2 hours into their daily lives, much in the same way that nobody brushes their teeth 3 times a day. It's also important to practice just general, I guess what you could call sun risk management techniques. So if you're not going to be reapplying constantly, it does behoove you to generally stay indoors, away from the sun, or in the shade, to wear hats, curse you big hat, when you go out. Things like that. Don't use tanning beds. Don't go out for long periods of time in the sun without reapplication. If you do anything to strip off layers of your skin, thereby making the tender cells underneath exposed to more sunlight, then yeah, absolutely reapply. Once you know about how skin works and how sunscreen works, well, this all becomes common sense stuff. Some sunscreens are even designed to be long wear sunscreens, so look for that on the bottle. It also helps if you can avoid touching your face because, you know, you'll rub off your protection if you do it too much. Is it possible to wear sunscreen under makeup? Absolutely! Instead of relying on sunscreen to be your makeup, what I recommend is putting on sunscreen, giving it that 15-20 minutes to let it set up into a nice even film, and then putting your makeup on top of that. Some sunscreens actually can work really well as makeup primers. This is just an anecdote, but ever since I became interested in skincare and started wearing sunscreen every day, I have absolutely noticed positive changes in my skin, even if I don't reapply throughout the day. My acne heals more quickly, my hyperpigmentation is fading, and just in general, my skin is better. It's just my personal attitude, but I think that for a lot of people, that's gonna be their reality. Alright, so what have we learned on this sunny journey? We've learned all the horrible things the sun can do to your skin, how to protect from those effects, the best kinds of sunscreen filters to use for protection, that organic sunscreen filters are not made from the urine of Lucifer, and how to properly apply and reapply your sunscreen. Oh, and that all of that is backed up by tons and tons of scientific studies. Obviously, there's so much more science that is out there, and I will absolutely leave a lot of it linked in the description below. I hope I've provided you with enough information that you can go out and be confident picking a sunscreen that's going to suit your unique needs. Very soon, I'm going to be doing a big review of all of the sunscreens that I have been testing for the last 2.5 years. It's gonna be a lot. And I've obviously been selecting for the types of criteria that I mentioned in this video. So stay tuned for that. But until then, stay safe in the sun, and if you're unsure about your sunscreen, always wear a hat. Because Big Hat is watching us. Bye, y'all!